The listing found me on a Monday night in Vineland, New Jersey, while I sat at my sister Danielle's kitchen table in Millville going through Mateo's endocrinologist bills for what felt like the 100th time that same exhausting month. The insulin alone costing nearly $400 every single time the pharmacy filled it, without insurance covering more than a small fraction of that total. I had been let go from the fulfillment center in Pennsauken 8 weeks earlier, the second round of seasonal cuts in a single year, finally reaching a woman who had never once missed a shift in almost 4 years of steady work, sorting and scanning boxes on that same overnight line. My ex-husband Anthony was 3 months behind on child support by then, a total of $2,100 he kept promising to catch up on as soon as his own construction work picked back up again that winter, a promise that never once seemed to arrive on schedule the way he described it. Mateo's diabetes had been diagnosed only the previous spring, and between the insulin, the continuous glucose monitor supplies, and the specialist visits down in Camden, I was already carrying $7,400 of credit card debt that grew a little heavier every single billing cycle, no matter how carefully I tried to budget around it that year. Danielle had let us move into her spare bedroom without ever once complaining about it out loud, but I could see the strain of 2 extra people crowding her small apartment settling into her shoulders more with every week that passed that autumn. The posting itself sat near the bottom of a South Jersey classifieds board I had wandered into looking for any kind of overnight work I could find. A single paragraph titled, "Night Clerk Needed, Seasonal Motor Court, Pine Barrens Property," posted by someone signing only as property management for the Halsey Family Trust. It described a small roadside motel called the Amber Light Motor Court sitting along County Route 563, just outside a place called Chatsworth in Woodland Township, a name I recognized only vaguely from a childhood trip through Wharton State Forest with my father many years before that. The pay line stopped me the same way it probably stopped every other tired woman who scrolled past it that same week. $42,000 for a 4-month winter season contract, running from the first week of November clean through the first week of March that following year. Half was paid at signing and the other half paid only on successful completion of the full term, a structure that read to me at the time as ordinary caution on a trust's part rather than anything worth losing sleep over that night at Danielle's kitchen table. I wrote back within the hour, keeping the message short and practical the way I would with any job that actually mattered to me and to Mateo both. And a reply came back before I'd even closed the tab on my laptop screen that same evening. The woman signed her message Yvonne Marchetti, property manager for the Halsey Family Trust, and her tone carried the same brisk, unbothered confidence I associated with people who managed land and money for a living rather than people who worked overnight shifts, scanning boxes the way I always had before that fulfillment center let me go. She asked only a handful of practical questions, whether I could keep a reliable overnight schedule without much outside supervision, whether long stretches of quiet isolation in an off-season motel would give me any real trouble, and whether I would be able to arrange care for Mateo across 4 full months away from home that winter. I told her honestly that Danielle had already agreed to keep Mateo with her for the length of any job that paid enough to finally get us caught up, and that solitude sounded, if anything, like a strange kind of relief after a year that had already taken so much from both of us that autumn. She called the following afternoon, and her voice on the phone matched her writing closely enough that I pictured her almost exactly as she turned out to look the one time we finally stood face to face weeks later outside a gas station in Chatsworth. Yvonne explained the position in more detail over that first call, describing the Amber Light Motor Court as a roadside motel the Halsey family had operated in one form or another since the years just after the Second World War, though the family itself now lived mostly in Cherry Hill and Moorestown and visited the property only rarely anymore. The trust kept it technically open through the winter off-season with a skeleton staff of exactly 1, mostly to satisfy an old operating covenant tied to the land itself rather than because the 11 small cabins ever actually filled with paying guests during those cold, quiet months. She said I would need to live on site in the manager's quarters attached to the office, keep the small building and grounds maintained, and perform what she called a short list of standing house rules each night. A phrase she used so casually that I did not think much of it at the time she first said it to me over that same crackling call. The rules themselves, once she finally read them out to me in full, sounded almost quaint compared to the money attached to them, and I remember thinking that I had stumbled onto the easiest $42,000 a woman in my position could ever hope to earn across a single winter of otherwise ordinary night clerk work. The amber neon vacancy sign mounted above the office had to stay lit continuously from the moment the light failed each evening until the sun cleared the tree line each following morning, with no exceptions made for weather, power trouble, or anything else that might interrupt it during the long overnight hours. Every single guest who arrived at the office, whether they actually rented a room or simply asked a question and drove on, had to be written by hand into the paper ledger kept on the front desk. Full name and license plate, both, with no guest ever turned away from that entry regardless of the hour, or how strange the request might seem, standing there at the counter. Room 6, the last cabin on the row closest to the tree line behind the property, was never to be rented, unlocked, or entered by anyone for any reason at all, a rule Yvonne repeated twice in a tone that made clear she considered it the single most important line in the whole list of house rules she had just read to me. The black courtesy phone mounted on the office wall had to be answered by the third ring at any hour of the day or night, even if the line sounded dead or nobody spoke on the other end once I finally picked it up, with any strange calls noted afterward in the same ledger used for guests. And every evening at 9 o'clock, exactly, I would need to walk the tree line behind the last row of cabins with a flashlight, counting 6 low, sunken marker posts, driven into the ground decades earlier along the edge of the cedar bog, checking each one for disturbance without ever once stepping past that line into the bog itself. Yvonne called it an old set of house rules left over from decades of continuous operation, something the original owners had apparently insisted on for generations, and the trust had simply never found any good reason to formally discontinue given how little it cost to maintain each season. I asked her why a roadside motel with barely any winter guests still needed a routine this involved, and she told me only that old properties sometimes carried old habits. Nobody living today fully understood the original reasoning behind anymore, not even the family who still insisted on keeping them intact. It struck me as a strange answer even then, though $7,400 of credit card debt has a way of making a tired woman accept a strange answer far more easily than she probably should under better circumstances. And I let the question drop without pushing much further that same evening at Danielle's table. I signed the contract 2 days later, a document running nearly 17 pages thick with clauses about liability and confidentiality, and something the paperwork itself simply called the Standing House Rules, capitalized every single time it appeared anywhere in that same dense text I read twice through before finally signing my name at the bottom of it. I drove south out of Millville on the last Sunday of October, my car loaded with warm clothes, a box of paperback novels, and a folder of Yvonne's typed instructions I had already read through more times than I could easily count by the time I finally crossed into Burlington County that same gray afternoon. The drive into Chatsworth took me east along Route 542 and then south onto 563, the pine and scrub oak closing in tighter around the road with every passing mile until the shoulder disappeared entirely into sandy soil and low cedar swamp on both sides of the pavement. Chatsworth itself turned out to be smaller even than I had pictured from Yvonne's description. Little more than a general store, a firehouse, and a scattering of houses set back from the road. The kind of place a person could drive through in under a minute without ever quite registering they had passed through a town at all. I met Yvonne Marchetti in person outside that general store exactly as we had arranged over the phone. A compact woman in her 50s, wearing a wool coat that looked considerably more expensive than anything else parked in that gravel lot, standing beside a newer crossover with the engine already running against the cold. She shook my hand firmly and studied me for a moment with an expression I read at the time as simple, professional appraisal, though I would come to recognize it much later as something closer to quiet, practiced guilt standing there in that small parking lot outside the store. We drove the final 4 miles out to the property together in her car, the road narrowing further still before opening onto a wide gravel lot where the amber light motor court sat waiting beneath a hand-painted sign whose amber neon letters had clearly been replaced and repaired more than once across the many decades that motel had apparently stood along that same stretch of highway. The property consisted of a small office building with an attached manager's apartment, and behind it a single row of 11 small cabins running in a straight line back toward a dense wall of cedar and pitch pine that marked the beginning of the bog proper according to Yvonne's own careful description that same cold afternoon. She walked me through the standing house rules in person that first day, showing me the neon signs breaker panel, the black courtesy phone screwed firmly to the office wall, and the 6 weathered marker posts sunk into the sandy ground at the tree line behind the last cabin on the row. She was oddly specific about room 6 itself, telling me twice that the door had to remain locked at all times regardless of how full the other 10 cabins happened to get on any given night, and that under no circumstance was I to rent it to a guest, no matter how insistently they might ask for it standing at my own front desk. She told me that if the sign ever went dark for any reason during the overnight hours, I should relight it as quickly as I possibly could and note the exact length of time it had gone out in the ledger, along with anything unusual I noticed that particular night out there. It struck me as excessive for what she kept insisting was only an old operating tradition, but I filed the instruction away without much argument, eager to finish the tour before the last gray light disappeared behind that dense wall of cedar at the edge of the property. She left me that evening with a stocked pantry, a working cell signal booster mounted on the office roof, and a laminated card explaining how to reset the breaker panel and the well pump in case either one ever failed during the long winter months ahead of me out there. By the time her taillights finally vanished back down that gravel road toward the highway, I stood alone in that small office in a silence more complete than anything I had known in years. The kind of flat, piney quiet that makes a person suddenly aware of her own breathing in a way ordinary town life rarely ever demands of her. I told myself that first night, lying in the narrow bed in the manager's apartment and listening to wind move steadily through the pines outside my window, that $42,000 was $42,000, no matter how strange the standing house rules had sounded. Standing in that gravel lot earlier that same afternoon, the first 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful once my body adjusted to the cold and the long overnight hours. The kind of structured solitude I had not realized I was craving until it was finally laid out in front of me every single day of that stretch out there. I checked the sign each evening the moment the light began to fail, watched the office phone through the quiet hours with the paperback open on the counter, and walked the tree line at 9 exactly, counting all 6 marker posts against the flashlight beam before turning back toward the warm office each night. I logged every single guest by hand in the paper ledger with the same careful precision I had once brought to scanning barcodes down a warehouse conveyor line for 4 straight years before that fulfillment center let me go without much warning at all that same autumn. I noted in the ledger each night that nothing unusual had occurred, because for those first 2 peaceful weeks along that quiet stretch of highway, nothing truly had happened to me at all yet that winter. I drove into Chatsworth once during that stretch for groceries. The small pantry was running low on, and the woman who ran the general store, a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s named Iris Bellingham who had apparently run the place since before I was even born, filled my order without much conversation beyond the passing comment about the early cold that year. She asked almost idly where exactly I was staying for the winter, and I noticed her expression shift the instant I mentioned the Ember Light by name. A small flicker across her face that might have been surprise or might have been something closer to pity settling in for just a moment before she caught herself in front of me. I asked her what that look meant, and she waved the question off with a short laugh that did not quite reach her eyes, telling me only that the Halsey place went through night clerks about as fast as some of the Cranberry outfits used to go through pickers fresh off the bus every single harvest season out there. She told me I should not read too much into small-town talk about a property most people in Chatsworth had mostly stopped thinking about years ago, and it was an answer that satisfied me well enough that afternoon, mostly because I badly wanted it to be true, after everything that job's money already meant for Mateo, and for me that whole winter ahead of us. I drove back out to the motel with a trunk full of groceries and a bag of rock salt for the office steps, and I did not think much more about her reaction for the rest of that quiet drive back through the pines that same gray afternoon. It was not until the small wrongness finally started, slow at first, that I understood the kind of thing a person can talk herself out of for a week or two, before the explanations simply stop holding together at all out there along that lonely highway. The wrongness began with a name in the ledger, sometime in the middle of that 3rd week. A guest who signed in on a Tuesday night as a man named Corwin Adderley from a Delaware address I later could not find listed anywhere at all, despite searching every public record I could think to check on my phone the following morning. He had asked for a room, paid in cash exactly $45 for a single night, and walked back out toward a dark-colored sedan parked at the far edge of the gravel lot. Though when I checked the assigned cabin the following afternoon, the bed had never once been slept in, and the key still hung untouched on its hook by the office door. I told myself he had simply changed his mind and driven on somewhere else that same night, a reasonable enough explanation that held together well enough until I noticed, flipping back through the older pages of that same ledger out of idle curiosity one slow evening, at least 4 other names across the preceding weeks, with that exact same pattern beside them, room paid for and never once actually used. 2 nights after I first noticed Corwin Adderley's name sitting there in my own handwriting, the courtesy phone rang a little after 2 in the morning, and when I answered it by the third ring exactly as the house rules required of me, I heard nothing at all on the other end beyond the low, steady sound that reminded me uncomfortably of water moving slowly through something narrow and enclosed somewhere far away from wherever the call was actually originating from that night. I said hello twice into that silence before finally hanging up, logging the call in the ledger exactly as instructed and describing the sound as clinically as I could manage for a woman standing alone at a front desk at 2 in the morning with her heart still pounding hard behind her ribs. It happened again the following week, the same low, watery sound filling the line for nearly a full minute before it finally cut off on its own, and I began keeping the phone's handset a little closer to the desk after that. Some part of me already bracing for it to ring again before it actually did each time that same pattern repeated itself out there. By the start of the 4th week, the small wrongness had accumulated into something I could no longer file away as an overtired mind playing tricks on itself out in that much isolation for the very first time in my adult life since Mateo's diagnosis had upended everything about how I lived. The thing that finally cracked my easy explanations wide open was a narrow closet door at the back of the office storage room I had assumed those first few weeks led only to cleaning supplies or some forgotten inventory of no real interest to a busy night clerk with plenty else to manage each evening out there. One night while hunting for a replacement fuse, I noticed the padlock on it looked newer than everything else in that storage room. Brushed steel set against hardware that otherwise looked to have hung there unchanged since the office itself was first built sometime in the years just after the war ended. Yvonne's paperwork had said nothing at all about a locked closet anywhere on the property, and her contract had specifically stated that I held full access to every structure on site for the entire length of my 4-month stay out there that winter season. I told myself that checking behind that door counted less as trespassing and more as basic due diligence for a woman alone on that property who deserved to understand exactly what she was living beside for 4 long months of her own life away from her son that year. It took me most of an evening working with an old set of picks I still remembered from a summer I once spent helping my uncle rekey locks around Vineland as a teenager. But the padlock finally gave way beneath my patient, half-frozen fingers late that same night in the storage room. Behind it, I found a narrow space someone had clearly used as an archive rather than a closet. Shelves of yellowed paperwork, older ledgers far more worn than the one I logged my own daily readings in, and a corkboard along the back wall covered edge to edge with photographs of men and women I did not recognize at all, standing in front of that same small office. Most of the photographs carried a year written along the bottom edge in the same cramped handwriting, stretching back across the decades: 1951, 1968, 1984, 2003. Each name beneath each photograph followed by a short handwritten notation in that same tight hand across every single entry. In every single case, that notation read either left without notice or did not complete term. Phrases that felt, standing there in the cold and the dust of that small hidden room, far less reassuring than they had probably sounded to whoever first wrote them down years earlier, out there along that quiet highway. I did not mention the archive closet to Yvonne during our next scheduled call, some instinct telling me she would only offer another calm, practiced explanation that would do nothing to actually settle the growing unease sitting heavy in my chest by then that whole week. I did tell her about the strange calls on the courtesy phone, describing them as carefully and as flatly as I could manage while she listened without interrupting me even once through the entire account I gave her that same evening. She was quiet for a beat longer than felt entirely natural before telling me that old phone lines out in that part of the Pine Barrens sometimes picked up interference from the bog itself, moisture and old copper wiring combining to produce sounds that could seem almost deliberate to someone not yet used to hearing them out there at night. That explanation technically held together on its own terms, but it did nothing to explain why she then asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the amber sign had been burning steadily every single night that week. a question she had never once asked me before on any of our earlier calls together since I first arrived that November. She would go on to ask me that exact same question, I noticed only much later. Every single time I mentioned anything at all unusual for the remainder of my long winter contract out there along that quiet stretch of highway, as though the answer mattered to her far more than she ever let on to me directly. There was another incident that same week I did not write about in the ledger at all, mostly because I could not think of a clinical enough way to describe it without sounding, even to myself, like a woman whose isolation had finally started working on her own mind out there alone. I was carrying firewood back from the shed a little before dusk when I heard what sounded like several low voices murmuring together somewhere back near the tree line. Too faint to make out clear words, but carrying a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of people reciting something together in a slow, patient unison out past that last row of cabins. I stood there with the firewood still stacked in my arms, scanning the dark wall of cedar for a long minute before telling myself it had been wind moving through the bog's low branches that only sounded, for one bad moment, like human voices keeping time together somewhere close by that property. I did not go looking to confirm it either way, and I did not mention it to Iris Bellingham the next time I saw her in town, some part of me already deciding that naming the fear out loud would only make it feel more real than it already did standing alone in that gravel lot at dusk that evening. I drove into Chatsworth again near the end of that same week, mostly for a fresh case of coffee and a few groceries I had let run low. And I found myself asking Iris more directly than I had before about whoever had worked the property just ahead of me on the rotation that same trust apparently kept running year after year along that stretch of highway. She set down the crate she was stocking behind the counter and studied me for a long moment before answering, the kind of look a person gives someone she is deciding whether to actually trust with something true, rather than something merely comfortable to say out loud in her own store. His name was Desmond Farrow, Iris told me finally. A quiet man from down near Egg Harbor who kept to himself the same way I apparently did, coming into town maybe once every couple of weeks for supplies, and never staying long enough for anyone to get to know him well at all that same winter before mine. He finished his contract clean, she said, which I understood even then to be an unusual enough detail that she felt the need to specify it out loud, as though most clerks before him had not finished quite so cleanly on that same property along that road. When I asked whether Desmond had ever mentioned anything strange about the motel, anything about the phone or the marker posts or a locked closet in the office, Iris's whole expression closed off right in front of me the same way it had that very first afternoon back in October when I first mentioned the property's name. She told me plainly that she did not gossip about paying customers, current or former, and that if the trust wanted me to know more about the job than they had already told me, they would have told me themselves without needing her help with any of it. It was not an unkind answer, exactly, but it carried a weight that told me she already knew more than she was willing to say out loud to a stranger who might still be reporting back to the people who signed her own invoices every single month of the year out there. I thanked her for the groceries and was almost out the door with the little bell above it jangling behind me when she called my name once, quietly, from behind the counter still, in a voice pitched low enough that no one else in the store could have easily overheard her that same afternoon. She told me only to be careful about which doors I went looking behind out there, a warning vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough that I thought about it for the entire drive back through the pines afterward that same cold evening. I spent longer than I probably should have that same night working through the older ledgers stacked in the office archive closet, comparing handwriting and dates from one battered volume to the next as the wind outside slowly picked up toward another long, cold December dusk out there along that quiet road. I found a pattern that unsettled me more with every page I turned, entries growing steadily shorter and more clipped in the final weeks of nearly every clerk's term, regardless of which decade I happened to be reading through at any given stretch that evening in that narrow, dusty room. Careful daily notations about the sign and the phone and the marker posts gradually gave way to fragmented lines about sounds, about smells, and about shapes glimpsed at the edge of the tree line, once full dark had settled over the property each night that same season. Then the entries simply stopped altogether, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes with entire weeks still remaining on what should have been a full 4-month term of employment for whoever had been keeping that particular volume up until then that same year. One ledger from the early 1970s ended on a page where the handwriting had grown so tight and cramped it was almost illegible, even after I held it close under the lamp for a long, careful minute that same night in that narrow room. Its final entry read only "It keeps count of who was kind to it," followed by nothing else at all, no signature and no closing note. Just several blank pages before the next volume's much neater hand began again the following autumn out there. I sat with that ledger open on my lap until the light through the storage room's small window had gone from pale gray to full dark. And when I finally checked my watch, I realized I had less than 10 minutes left before the sign needed checking. And my 9 o'clock walk along the tree line would already be running late that same night. I ran the whole way across the frozen gravel lot with a fear in my chest I could not fully explain to myself, my boots sliding once on a patch of ice. Before I finally reached the marker posts with barely a minute of true darkness, settled fully over that whole stretch of property behind me. I counted all 6 posts with a flashlight beam that would not quite hold steady in my own shaking hand, moving through the ritual that apparently every clerk before me had once performed along that same tree line before I ever arrived there myself that winter. I did not sleep well that night, replaying the ledger's broken fragments over and over in my tired head until gray morning light finally crept through the office window overlooking the empty gravel lot below. I woke determined to find real answers rather than continue guessing at whatever history the trust had gone to such careful trouble to keep entirely out of the contract I had originally signed back in Millville that same October. I drove north that same morning toward Mount Holly, the Burlington County seat large enough to still have a proper historical society, with any real archive worth searching through for a woman in my position that particular week. The drive took nearly an hour along quiet county roads that wound between cranberry bogs and stands of pitch pine before finally opening onto the wider, more settled streets of Mount Holly itself, a town that felt strangely bright and ordinary after 5 weeks spent mostly alone along that dark stretch of highway near Chatsworth. The Historical Society occupied the ground floor of a converted brick building 2 blocks off the main square, its front windows crowded with old Cranberry Harvest photographs alongside a hand-lettered sign, advertising a spring lecture series on Pine Barrens folklore each year in that same small county building. I sat outside in my car for a full 5 minutes before finally going in, running through exactly what I planned to say to a stranger about ledgers and locked closets and a courtesy phone that carried the sound of moving water on nights when no storm was anywhere near that whole stretch of highway. In the end, I settled on telling the archivist only that I was researching the general history of a property I currently worked, which was true enough not to feel like an outright lie spoken right to her own face that morning in that quiet reading room. I was hoping someone there might recognize the name Halsey Sand and Charcoal Company, a name I had found stamped into the spine of nearly every old ledger stacked on those office archive shelves back at the motel that same season. The archivist, a soft-spoken woman in her 70s named Constance Weller, who had apparently spent most of her career cataloging bog iron and charcoal records for half the abandoned company towns scattered across the Pine Barrens, recognized the company name almost immediately that same morning. She pulled a thin folder of yellowed newspaper clippings from a filing cabinet without needing to check any index first, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had handled that particular folder more than once before that same visit to her small archive. She told me the Halsey operation had once run one of the larger sand and charcoal camps in that whole part of the county, right up until a storm during the terrible September of 1938 changed everything about how the family managed that property from then on. That storm, Constance told me, was the same great hurricane that tore through New England and the Jersey Shore that same September, arriving with almost no warning at all along a stretch of coast that had never once seen anything like it in living memory before that particular week. 9 laborers working the Halsey sand pit had taken shelter in a low storage cellar dug into the bank behind the camp office as the worst of the wind and rain finally reached that isolated stretch of Pine Barren late on a Wednesday afternoon that same terrible year. The bog wall above the cellar gave way sometime after dark, flooding the storage space in what a surviving foreman later described to a county inspector as less than 4 minutes from the first crack of timber to the moment the water finally stopped rising around them completely. The official cause listed in every surviving county record was a structural failure triggered by unprecedented storm surge working against a poorly reinforced cellar wall, a straightforward explanation that satisfied the state inspector sent down from Trenton without much apparent difficulty at the time that same autumn. Constance mentioned, almost as an aside, while she sorted carefully through the rest of that same folder, that several surviving crew members interviewed by a Philadelphia newspaper reporter in the weeks after the flood gave accounts that never made it into that paper's final printed version at all that year. Those accounts describe sounds coming from the flooded cellar for nights afterward, a low murmuring that rescue crews first mistook for men still calling out from somewhere beneath the collapsed bank itself, before the company finally called off the recovery effort entirely. The company sealed the cellar with a poured concrete cap less than 3 weeks after the flood on Warren Halsey's own personal orders, an unusually swift decision for a man who still, on paper at least, owed formal death benefits to 9 grieving families waiting on word from that same camp office that same season. Constance also found, tucked into the back of that same folder, a photocopy of a memo dated several months after the sealing, written by an insurance investigator the company had retained, named Walton Spear. It was addressed to Warren Halsey directly, and marked, even in photocopy, with a stamp reading confidential in faded ink that had bled slightly into the surrounding paper over the many decades since it was first written that year. The memo was strange enough that Constance read part of it aloud to me herself, since she admitted she had never quite known what to make of it in all her years handling that particular collection of company records from the archive. It described what Spear called a persistent disturbance originating from the sealed cellar site, one he believed the company would be wiser to manage through continuous nightly welcome and small acknowledgement, rather than through any further attempt at abandoning the ground entirely that season. Before I left her archive that afternoon, Constance pulled one further item from a separate drawer she said she rarely showed to anyone who came through asking about the Halsey operation. A typed transcript of testimony given by the surviving foreman to a county coroner some 3 weeks after the flood had finally been declared closed for good that same autumn. The man's name was Otis Cranmer, and his testimony described standing at the edge of the flooded cellar site on the 4th night after the storm, listening alongside another crew member to a sound rising from beneath the sealed ground that neither of them could bring himself to fully name in front of the coroner conducting that same hearing that week. He described it only as a kind of patient reciting, low and calm and strangely deliberate, given everything those 9 men must have suffered in their final minutes trapped beneath that flooded cellar during the worst storm the county had ever recorded up to that point. Cranmer testified that the reciting continued each night for 9 nights running before finally going quiet, and that he personally requested a transfer off the Halsey payroll the following spring, rather than spend one more season working anywhere within sight of that sealed cellar again in his life. The coroner's official report dismissed the testimony as understandable shock following a traumatic workplace disaster, a conclusion Constance said she had always found a little too convenient given how carefully the company had otherwise documented every other detail surrounding that same flood in its own private papers. She told me, folding the transcript carefully back into its sleeve before returning it to the drawer, that she had shown it to exactly 2 other researchers in nearly 30 years of running that archive, and that both of them had asked her afterward, in roughly the same careful and hesitant tone I was using with her, that same quiet afternoon, whether the Halsey family still owned that property out there at all. I did not tell her that the trust did, or that I currently lived and worked on that same ground through the coldest 4 months of every year. Some instinct telling me plainly that the less anyone else in Mount Holly knew about my own connection to the Amber Light, the better it would be for everyone involved, herself included that day. I drove back south that same evening with the photocopied memo folded carefully in my jacket pocket beside the credit card statement I still had not managed to pay down, arriving at the motel with barely enough daylight left to walk the tree line before full dark settled in around me, completely across that quiet stretch of highway. As I approached the marker post near the last cabin on the row, I noticed a set of narrow, deep prints crossing the sandy ground just inside the boundary. Prints that did not match any animal I had grown used to seeing near that bog during my 5 weeks out there so far that winter. I checked the amber sign that evening with Spear's memo still folded in my pocket, watching the familiar orange glow steady itself against the coming dark, with a new and very specific dread settling deep into my chest as I stood there in that empty gravel lot afterward. I understood for the first time that the routine I had been performing every single day without much real thought was not, as Yvonne had implied back in October, Some outdated operating tradition left over from an overcautious old family's paperwork from another century entirely. It was something closer to what Speer himself had called it in his own careful handwriting. A nightly proof of welcome offered to whatever still lingered beneath that sealed cellar where 9 men once drowned together nearly a century earlier out there, along that same quiet stretch of Pine Barren. I found myself wondering, standing alone in the gathering dark with a sign finally glowing steady above the office roof, what exactly happened to a clerk who simply let that light go dark even once during her own long winter out there on that property. I brought the memo to Yvonne during our next scheduled call and told her plainly that I needed real answers now rather than another vague reference to old copper wiring and overcautious family tradition left over from a company that had not technically existed under that same name in nearly 90 years. After a long pause on the line, she finally admitted in a clipped tone that suggested she had rehearsed the disclosure before for other clerks standing exactly where I now stood, that the property carried what she called an unusual liability tied to the 1938 storm. She said the Standing House rules existed specifically to manage that liability, rather than to prevent any conventional structural failure of the kind listed so plainly in my own original signed contract paperwork back in Millville that same October. She would not elaborate much further beyond confirming that every clerk before me had received that exact same limited explanation once circumstances eventually forced her own hand to finally offer it up to them as well that season. She reminded me, with what felt like genuine unease rather than simple corporate caution, that my contract still had nearly 10 weeks remaining, and that leaving early would forfeit not only my second payment, but also whatever protection the completed house rules were apparently meant to provide a woman in my position that winter. 3 days later, Yvonne drove out to the property herself, arriving in a rented crossover loaded down with extra grocery supplies and a case of firewood the trust wanted delivered to me in person, rather than left to run out on its own that same cold week. She walked the tree line with me that whole windy afternoon without once mentioning the ledger entries or the sign readings the way she normally always did each week over the phone between us that season. Near the marker posts, she finally stopped and stood quietly for a while, studying the deep, narrow prints I had already photographed and reported to her office days earlier that same week, her breath fogging slow and steady in the cold air between us. I watched something pass across her face that looked, for the first time since I had known her at all, less like ordinary corporate caution and more like plain human guilt settling over her right there in that windy gravel lot behind the last cabin on the row. I asked her outright how long she herself had actually known what the sign and the ledger and the phone truly protected against on that whole property, and she was quiet long enough that I genuinely thought she might not answer me at all that afternoon out there. She finally admitted she had taken this exact management job 7 years earlier under circumstances not entirely unlike my own, a sick parent and a mountain of medical debt, and a listing that had seemed, at the time, like the answer to a prayer she had stopped believing anyone would actually answer for her. Before she left that evening, she pressed an envelope into my hand containing an extra $1,200 in cash. Money, she said, was not on any invoice and would never appear on any tax document the trust filed with the state of New Jersey that year. She told me to consider it hazard pay, from one person who understood exactly what the job truly cost to another who was still out there paying that same cost in real time, entirely alone along that quiet highway. I nearly left that same week anyway, sitting up one night with a bag half packed and my car fueled and ready in the gravel lot, doing the math again on debts I still owed and a son whose insulin I could not afford to interrupt, even for a single month, while I figured out something safer to do with my own life instead that winter. I understood, with a bitterness I still carry with me even now, that $42,000 represented the difference between finally climbing out of the hole Mateo's diagnosis had dug for both of us, or sinking further into it completely alone with no one left nearby to call for help out there. Whatever lingered beneath that sealed cellar, I had already survived weeks of small wrongness against it, and could likely survive 10 more weeks if I simply refused to let the sign or the ledger or the phone ever fail under my watch again that season along that highway. I unpacked that bag before dawn, ashamed of how close I had actually come to running from a job I had promised to finish, and I recommitted myself to the house rules with a rigor that bordered on total obsession from that morning forward through the rest of that winter. I checked the sign's wiring twice through every single night instead of only once before bed, and I set 3 separate alarms on my phone every single afternoon to make absolutely certain I never again came within even a few minutes of missing that 9 o'clock walk along the marker posts behind the last cabin. I began keeping a small backup battery lantern charged beside the office desk as well. Some part of me deciding that a light kept only through the fragile grid running out to that isolated stretch of highway was not a light I could fully trust to hold through whatever winters still had waiting for me out there. The nor'easter that rolled through during the second week of December answered, far more thoroughly than I ever wanted. It answered the question I had been quietly turning over since that first conversation with Yvonne near the marker posts earlier that same month. The forecast on my phone that morning had called for 6 to 8 inches of wet snow, manageable enough by the standards I had already grown used to on that particular stretch of Pine Barren over the past several weeks of steady winter weather that season. The storm stalled directly over Burlington County instead of moving through the way the forecast predicted, and by early evening the wind was gusting so hard that I watched a full section of the split rail fence along the front lot simply fold over and collapse into the snow without any warning at all. The power flickered twice around 7 that same evening, before finally failing completely a little after 8, taking the amber sign dark, along with every other light in the office, and leaving me standing there in the sudden blackness, with only my phone's flashlight to see by across that whole silent room. I grabbed the backup battery lantern and forced myself out into the storm toward the breaker panel mounted on the shed wall. Following a length of rope I had tied weeks earlier between the office door and the shed for exactly this kind of emergency situation out there, along that isolated stretch of highway. The wind out there carried something beneath its own roar that I could not make myself believe was only weather, a low murmuring rising and falling in a pattern too close to voices reciting together for my comfort inside that storm that whole night. It was close enough that I found myself checking back over my own shoulder every few steps despite seeing nothing at all beyond 3 feet of driving snow in every direction around me the whole time I fought toward that shed door through the dark. The breaker had tripped clean. An ordinary enough problem I had already handled once before without much real trouble, except that resetting it in that wind and cold cost me nearly 15 minutes I had not planned on losing with the sign already dark for longer than it had ever gone before that same winter. The moment the power finally caught again and the amber glow flickered back to life above the office roof, the courtesy phone inside began ringing, and I ran back through the storm to answer it, reaching the desk on what I counted afterward as the 5th ring, rather than the 3rd the house rules required of me at any hour of the day or night. I picked up the receiver with my hands still numb from the cold and heard, beneath the low watery sound I had already grown to dread across those past several weeks, something that might have been several voices speaking together in a rhythm too patient and too deliberate to be anything the storm itself could have produced on its own out there. For one long moment before the line finally went dead in my hand, I understood with a clarity that frightened me more than the sound itself, that whatever was on the other end of that phone had been counting the exact number of rings before I finally answered it that terrible night. I lodged that entry in the ledger with a hand I could barely make legible, describing the power failure and the delayed sign and the voices I had heard in language as clinical as I could possibly manage under the circumstances I had just lived through out there, along that dark stretch of highway. I noted at the bottom of the page the exact number of minutes the sign had stayed dark, 17, and the exact number of rings before I finally answered the phone, 5. 2 details that felt strangely important even though I could not have said exactly why at the time I wrote them down that night. 2 days later, once the storm had cleared enough for the roads to open again, Yvonne called and asked me, in a voice with an edge to it I had never once heard from her before that call, to confirm both of those specific numbers a second time before she would let the conversation move on to anything else at all that morning. The days that followed the storm carried a different quality of fear than anything I had felt before it. A fear grounded now in physical evidence rather than half-glimpsed shapes and half-heard sounds carried on the wind during a single bad night out there alone. I found fresh gouges cut into the wooden door of room 6 the following morning. 4 or 5 parallel grooves, each roughly the width of a finger but far too deep and far too evenly spaced to have come from any tool or claw I recognized from a lifetime spent living around ordinary Jersey woods and marshland near Vineland. I photographed the gouges and reported them to Yvonne that same afternoon, and I noticed something new in her voice on that call. A strain that told me she was no longer entirely certain the house rules alone would be enough to see me safely through the remainder of my long winter contract out there. I drove into Chatsworth once more that same week, mostly to buy a box of shells for a small handgun I had borrowed from Danielle's husband and a length of heavy chain I intended to run through the office door handles each night after dark. A precaution that felt almost embarrassing to explain to myself, even as I loaded it all into my car outside Iris's store. That same cold afternoon, Iris rang up the purchase without much comment, though she added a spare battery lantern to the counter unprompted and told me it was on the house this time. A small kindness that meant more to me standing there than the $22 it would have otherwise cost me that week. She told me, as I carried the last bag out to my car, that Desmond Farrow had bought the exact same length of chain from her the winter before mine, in nearly the exact same week of that same season, and that she had wondered even then whether she should have said more to him before he drove back out to that same motel afterward. I asked her directly what she thought I should do differently than Desmond apparently had, and she was quiet for a long moment before telling me only to keep that sign burning no matter what, every single night, no matter how tired or how frightened it made me feel, standing out there or how tired or how frightened it made me feel, standing out there alone in that gravel lot after dark. She added almost as an afterthought while I climbed into my car, that her own grandmother had worked one season sorting sand for the Halsey operation back before the storm ever happened at all, and that she had never once talked about those years afterward except to say that some ground simply remembers what gets taken from it, and does not much care how long a person waits before finally paying it back in full. Certain nights from the weeks that followed still stand out clearly to me even now, more so than the general blur of cold and grinding vigilance that swallowed most of that long December and the January that came after it without much mercy shown to me out there. There was the night in late December when I woke to find the office window fogged over from the inside with a thin gray film, and pressed into that film on the glass facing the tree line was the clear shape of a hand, fingers splayed wide, far larger than any hand I'd ever shaken in my own life before that winter along that highway. There was the night in early January when I came out to check the sign at dusk and found it already glowing steady, with a light I had not switched on myself and could not explain through any wiring trouble. I later checked twice over that same evening in the fading cold. I stood staring at that small amber glow for a long while before finally deciding I would rather have it burning through some means I did not understand than dark through any means I understood, all too well by then out there alone. There was the longer, worse stretch in late January when I woke 3 mornings running to find all 6 marker posts along the tree line turned to face inward toward the office rather than outward along the bog boundary the way I had always found them myself back in November. I turned each post back to its correct facing again, each of those 3 mornings, my hands steady only because I had stopped allowing myself the luxury of shaking by then, some cold and practical part of me having simply taken over where the fear used to sit inside my own chest. I never once let myself fully rest during that entire stretch, so that I would never once fail to hear the small alarm I had rigged from an old kitchen timer wired to a spare battery, set every single evening without fail to warn me a full hour before the sign needed its first check of the coming night. I made every single entry during those grinding weeks, every one moving through the ritual with hands that would not stop shaking even on the night in early February when I had a fever from a cold I could not afford to properly rest through out there alone. Every part of me wanted nothing more than to collapse in that narrow bed and let just one night pass without the house rules finally completed. But by then I understood something no contract clause or company memo could have ever fully taught a woman in my position that season along that road. There was one further night from that stretch I have never once written down or spoken aloud to anyone, not even Danielle during our longest phone calls that following summer when she pressed me harder than usual about what had actually happened out there across those 4 months. I woke sometime past 2 in the morning to the sound of my own name spoken once, low and flat and strangely toneless, carrying through the office wall from somewhere out in the gravel lot where no living person had any business standing at that particular hour of a New Jersey winter. I lay perfectly still for a long while, listening to my own pulse and telling myself it had been a dream, or the wind finding some new gap in the old building's frame that only sounded, for one bad moment, like a voice shaping the 2 syllables of my own name out there in the dark beyond that window. When I finally worked up the nerve to look through the frosted glass, I saw nothing at all beyond the amber sign, still burning steady where I had left it hours earlier, its light throwing long, thin shadows from the tree line that moved only with the wind, and nothing else that I could make out in that pale, guttering glow. I did not go outside to check any further that night, and I did not log the incident the following morning, the way the house rules technically required of me. Some part of me deciding that certain things were better carried alone than written down in a ledger. Some future clerk might eventually read the way I had read, all the ones that came before mine. I thought about Spears' line concerning familiarity, about a presence that learned a clerk's rhythm the longer she stayed alone on that ground without relief. And I understood, lying awake until the gray light of morning finally reached my small window, that it had learned mine considerably faster than I had wanted to believe possible that early in my own long contract there along that highway. The worst of those certain nights came in mid-February, roughly 3 weeks before the incident with the turned marker posts, when something struck the office door hard enough that I felt the impact through the floorboards under my bare feet before I ever heard the sound of it land against that old wood. I grabbed the handgun I had borrowed from Danielle's husband, more out of instinct than any real belief it would do much good against whatever waited out there. And I stood in the dark front room listening to a slow, deliberate scraping move along the porch boards from one end to the other and back again, without pause across that whole width of the office front. It stopped directly outside the door for what felt like a full minute, long enough that I could hear something that might have been breathing, if breathing could sound that wet and that uneven, coming through the old wood, only inches from where I stood frozen with the barrel raised and my finger resting light against the guard. I did not open that door and did not look through the window beside it, choosing instead to back slowly toward the hallway while keeping the barrel pointed at the entrance, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my own throat, standing there in that dark front room alone that night. Whatever it was eventually moved off the porch and out into the lot, its retreating steps growing fainter and less deliberate the farther they traveled from the office, until the ordinary sounds of wind and settling snow finally swallowed them completely sometime before dawn arrived that morning. I found a single mark in the snow near the bottom porch step the next morning. Not quite a footprint and not quite a handprint either, pressed deep enough into the crust that whatever left it had to weigh considerably more than any one person standing alone out there that night along that quiet highway. During one of my tree-lined walks in late February, taking a slightly wider loop than usual after a thaw had softened the ground enough to make walking easier off the packed trail near the 6th marker post, I found a weathered concrete stub half swallowed by the bog itself, well outside the boundary I normally kept to each evening along that same stretch of cedar and pine. Carved into it, worn nearly smooth by decades of weather but still legible enough to trace with a bare finger, was a single set of initials with no name beneath them and no date carved anywhere else on that same stub to identify who exactly they belonged to across all those years since the storm first took 9 men from that ground. I thought immediately of the archive closet's photographs and their short, clipped notations, and I stood over that sunken marker for a long time in the cold, wondering how many other quiet stones like it might be scattered across the acres of trust land surrounding that small motor court. I did not dig, and I did not disturb the ground around it any further than my own boots already had crossing that stretch of softened earth, choosing instead to photograph the stub carefully before continuing the rest of my loop in a silence that had nothing at all to do with the cold or the wind picking up along that tree line that particular evening. It was during the same grim, careful stretch of routine that I finally found the thing that explained everything, tucked inside a false panel at the back of the archive closet's bottom shelf where it met the office's original foundation wall along the back corner of that narrow room. I only discovered it because one of the old ledgers I had returned to its place sat slightly crooked, and when I reached to straighten it, my fingers caught the edge of a seam in the wood paneling that did not belong there at all among the surrounding boards. Behind that panel, I found a single leather-bound journal, far older than anything else in the room, its cover cracked and gone soft with age from decades of careful handling by whoever had hidden it there originally against discovery by anyone else at that motor court. Inside, in handwriting I matched after some careful study to the signature on Walton Spears' original 1938 memo, was a detailed and increasingly desperate account of the years he had spent quietly studying what he referred to throughout only as the kept. He never once used any more specific name for it, as though naming the thing more precisely carried its own particular kind of risk. He was unwilling to take even in a private journal meant for no other eyes but his own to ever read out there. Pierre's account, once I worked through his cramped and often water-damaged handwriting over the following several evenings, laid out a history far stranger and darker than the bare facts Constance Weller had already shown me back at Mount Holly weeks earlier at that small archive. It described how the 9 men trapped by the 1938 flood had, according to sounds the rescue crews documented before the effort was fully called off, remained alive and audible for at least 9 full days after the cellar finally filled around them completely that terrible September. They called out in a rhythm that 2 surviving crew members, both former camp foremen by trade, had come to recognize as something closer to a shared reciting than any ordinary human cry for help from trapped and drowning men beneath that flooded ground. Pierre's notes described what came after only in careful fragments, mentioning a sensitivity to welcome and to warmth, a hunger for company that stopped resembling ordinary human need at all, and a growing tendency to move and speak as a single body rather than as 9 separate and distinct men any longer beneath that bog. It began, in Spear's own unsettling phrase, to resemble a kept household slowly gathering itself around a single shared and endlessly patient longing that had not existed in any one of those men before the flood took them from each other and from themselves that same night. Warren Halsey's decision to seal the cellar a second time had come only after 2 separate crews sent to clear the wreckage refused to return to that section of the property at all, citing sounds and sights none of them would fully describe even under direct order from the company's own management that same season. Pierre's journal made painfully clear that the company understood, even then, that whatever now lingered where that cellar once stood was no longer simply 9 men who had drowned together in a single, terrible storm on a single terrible night that September. It had become something that gathered itself, slowly and with terrible patience, out of their shared fear of being forgotten into a single distributed presence, able to sense hospitality and attention from a considerable distance across that whole stretch of Pine Barren. Pierre estimated its effective range based on incidents documented over the following several decades since the flood, at no less than half a mile in every given direction from the sealed cellar itself out there. The 2 later abandonment attempts Sparrow referenced in his original memo had each ended, his journal explained in grim and unflinching detail, with grave losses at the surface structures nearest the sealed cellar that he described only in his own careful company language throughout that same account. In the first instance, that phrase in the fuller telling meant the deaths of 3 company men stationed at a nearby toll booth on the old Plank Road sometime in 1944. Found by a relief crew in a state Spear refused to describe any further than that single terse sentence in his own private journal that same page. In the second instance, it meant the complete disappearance without any trace at all of a family who had briefly attempted to run a roadside stand on a cleared section of that same property sometime back in the early 1950s before the trust bought them out entirely. That family had been entirely unaware of what actually lingered on the ground. They had so hopefully chosen to build a small stand upon that particular spring, years before Yvonne Marchetti or I ever set foot on that same property ourselves. Spear's eventual conclusion arrived at only after those 2 disasters and reluctantly accepted by a company board more concerned with liability than genuine understanding of what they were actually managing beneath it, was that the kept could not simply be starved into dormancy through silence and permanent abandonment of the ground. Silence and total neglect seemed only to make it more desperate and correspondingly far more dangerous to anyone still living or working nearby it on that particular stretch of highway above Chatsworth. One passage near the middle of the journal stayed with me more than any other, written in a steadier hand than the shaking entries near the end, and I copied it out onto a loose page of my own, so I would not have to keep reopening the fragile old book itself each time I wanted to reread it that winter. It is not memory in the way we mean the word among the living, Spear had written, but it keeps a guest list all the same, and it appears to want nothing more complicated in the end than to be welcomed by whoever stands watch above it on any given night of the year that passes it by. I have come to believe, he continued, that the sign means less as illumination than as proof someone still remembers what is owed, a debt the company earned the day it chose, a second sealing over further listening to men who were, whatever else they had become, still calling out from the water below that ground. I read that particular passage 3 or 4 separate times over the following weeks, usually late at night with the office lamp turned down low beside the ledger. And each time it left me with that exact same uneasy question sitting heavy in my chest along that road. I never managed to answer it for myself before my own contract finally ended, whether keeping that sign lit each night made me a true caretaker of that ground, or only the latest woman paying down a debt none of us had ever actually agreed to owe in the first place that season. Spears' notes made clear the kept could instead be managed indefinitely through a controlled routine of welcome and small tribute, which it seemed to interpret as a kind of company it was willing to accept in place of the true release from that ground it could presumably never actually receive on its own terms. That routine was combined with a fixed, reliable nightly signal sent out through the amber sign itself, which Spears' notes suggested the kept had slowly come to recognize as proof its watch remained deliberate and attended, rather than accidental and quietly abandoned the way it had been left twice before in the decades following the flood. It was a distinction that seemed to matter to it in ways Spear himself admitted he could not fully explain, even after years spent carefully studying the pattern from a cautious and respectful distance along that same stretch of highway above Chatsworth. The final pages of Spear's journal, written in a hand grown shaky with what I assumed at first was simply old age finally catching up with him, contained his last and most troubling observation of the entire account he had kept hidden behind that false panel for so many years of his own working life. It explained why the company had settled on a rotation of clerks rather than assigning any one person permanently to the role for the remainder of their entire working life along that whole stretch of road above the bog. Pierre had originally recommended the rotation himself out of simple humanitarian concern for the psychological toll the isolated work clearly took on any one person left alone out there, too long at a single stretch, without real relief from another living soul nearby. Then he began noticing a pattern he carefully documented across several consecutive clerks through the 1940s and into the 1950s, one that troubled him more than anything he had written before it in that same journal. The kept appeared to grow steadily more attuned to any single clerk's specific rhythm and daily presence the longer that person remained alone on site, without any real relief from another living soul nearby them during a season. It grew correspondingly more capable of anticipating exactly when the sign would be checked and exactly when the marker posts would be walked each and every single day of that particular clerk's long winter contract there along that road. It also grew more willing, Spear wrote, to test the boundaries of the whole arrangement in the weeks following any extended stretch of that familiarity between the ground and the person watching over it through the deep winter months. That testing took the form, in at least 3 documented cases before the company finally instituted a hard 4-month rotation limit, of increasingly bold incursions past the marked boundary during a clerk's final weeks on site before the contract came to its scheduled end that same season. In every one of those 3 cases, the incursions ended with the clerk resigning abruptly with no real explanation, or, in one case Spear described only in a terse and heavily crossed-out line near the very bottom of that page, not resigning at all. I closed the journal that night with my hands still not quite steady, finally understanding why every single ledger in that archive closet ended the exact same way it always did. Page after page after page after careful daily notations trailing off into fear across nearly 90 years of clerks who had come before me along that same road. I understood why Yvonne had always asked, almost reflexively, whether the sign had been burning properly every single time I mentioned anything even slightly unusual during our long weekly calls together across that whole winter I spent out there. I understood, with a dread that settled deep into my chest and did not fully leave for the remainder of my contract, that I had roughly 6 weeks left before reaching the point in the rotation where Spear's documented pattern of increasingly bold incursions had historically begun to appear in every previous clerk's own account of that same property. 6 weeks during which I would need to maintain perfect, unbroken discipline with the sign and the ledger and the phone if I hoped to reach the first week of March with my contract, my sanity, and my own life all still fully intact and unbroken by whatever waited beneath that sealed bog. Those 6 weeks passed in a blur of grim, exhausting vigilance that I do not fully remember now in individual detail, so much as in a general impression of cold and fear and relentless daily routine that never once let up on me for even a single evening across that whole stretch. I made every single check during that final stretch. Every one, holding the flashlight steady through wind and sleet, and one bitter week in late February, when the temperature never once climbed above 20 degrees for 5 straight days running out there along that highway. I never let myself fully rest through any of it, checking the sign's wiring every 2 hours through the night by an alarm I had rigged from the same old kitchen timer, refusing to trust my own tired judgment about when the connection had truly held steady enough to leave alone again. There were nights during that stretch when I heard the murmuring return beyond the tree line, always faint, always just at the edge of what I could clearly make out, and I learned to work through it without stopping, finishing the ledger entry and the marker count until the sign burned steady against whatever waited out there listening to me. There was one evening in late February when I found 3 of the marker posts scraped clean of their old paint markings, the bare wood beneath showing fresh and pale against the older weathered gray surrounding each one. And I repainted every single one of them before dusk, with hands I forced to stay steady through sheer will alone that day. I understood by then exactly what waited on the other side of a single missed evening, and I was simply not willing to find that particular thing out for myself firsthand, not after everything Spears' journal and my own eyes had already shown me across that long, grinding winter out there. Yvonne called on the final Sunday of my contract, the first week of March, to confirm the arrangements for closing out the property before that long winter season officially ended for good that particular year along that quiet highway. A truck and a small crew were coming out the following Wednesday to help me pack out and begin the handoff process for whichever clerk the trust had already lined up to replace me on that same rotation for the coming winter season. She mentioned that particular detail so casually, as though it were the single most unremarkable thing in the entire world, that it took me a long moment to fully register exactly what she had just said to me over that same phone line. A replacement was already hired, already briefed, already scheduled to arrive at the Amber Light less than a week after I finally left it behind for good, as though the position I had spent 4 brutal months surviving was simply a seat that could never sit empty for even a single day of the year out there. I asked her, more sharply than I probably should have given how much I still wanted that final payment to clear without any complication on the trust's end, whether the new clerk truly understood what he was actually agreeing to take on along that road. Yvonne's answer came back careful and practiced in a way that told me she had given some version of it many times before to many previous clerks standing exactly where I now stood behind that same front desk. Every clerk received precisely the information they needed at precisely the moment they were ready to receive it, she said. An answer that told me everything about how the trust had managed to keep this whole arrangement running quietly for well over 80 years, without a single word of it ever reaching a newspaper or a courtroom in New Jersey. The crew arrived that Wednesday morning exactly as promised, and I spent the whole day walking a stranger named Grady Sims from the trust's staff through the sign, the ledger, the phone, and the tree line walk one final time before my own long contract officially came to its close along that highway. I described the house rules in the same flat, careful language Yvonne had used with me 4 long months earlier, watching his eyes glaze slightly at what he clearly assumed was standard overcautious property management, rather than anything genuinely worth taking seriously out on that stretch of road. I found myself wanting more than once that entire afternoon to grab him by the jacket and tell him absolutely everything I knew. The phone calls, the murmuring, the scraping I had heard during that nor'easter, Spears' old journal still hidden in my duffel bag beneath a change of clothes I had not yet unpacked from my car. Every single time the words rose in my throat, I thought of the $42,000 still owed to me, half of it already spent clearing the credit card balance, and most of a season's worth of Mateo's insulin from the year before that same winter. I said nothing beyond what the official handoff required of me, telling myself that a full-grown man reading a contract with his own eyes wide open deserved the same chance to make his own choices that I had once made with mine back in October. I left that property the following morning with the second half of my payment already confirmed sitting in my bank account, and Spears' old journal zipped carefully away into the bottom of my duffel bag beside a stack of photographs I had taken of the archive closet before locking that panel shut behind me one final time that same week. I drove north through Chatsworth and then west toward Millville with the windows cracked despite the cold, needing the sound of moving air to fill a silence that felt, after 4 full months out there, almost unbearably loud in its own strange way inside that car. I told myself, somewhere past Hamilton, that I was finished with the Amber Light for good, that I would deposit the money, pay off what remained of my debts, and never think about that stretch of highway again if I could possibly help it for the rest of my life. For a while, through that spring and on into the following summer, that plan mostly held together. Though I noticed I had developed a habit I could not quite shake of leaving at least one lamp burning somewhere in Danielle's apartment every single night without exception. It was a small, persistent unease that never fully resolved itself, no matter how many months slowly passed or how very far I physically moved away from that particular stretch of Pine Barren above Chatsworth that whole year. Danielle noticed the change in me before I ever admitted it to her directly, asking most weekends that spring careful, roundabout questions about how the winter had actually gone out there for me. Month after long month alone away from Mateo, and from everything else that mattered in my life. I answered her mostly with half-truths about the cold weather and the long hours and a difficult but ultimately harmless employer who paid me very well indeed for my continued silence about all of it that whole season. I told her the money had cleared the credit card and most of Mateo's back insulin costs, which was true, and that I felt more like myself again than I had in years, which was not quite true, but close enough that I could say it without my voice giving anything away over the phone between us that spring. She asked once, toward the end of June, why I still kept a small lamp burning in the hallway every single night even after Mateo had gone to bed during a weekend visit, a habit she had noticed and mentioned only once before letting it drop entirely between us that week. I told her it was just an old habit from working alone out there, nothing more than that, and she accepted the answer the way she had accepted most of my answers since the divorce, gently and without much real conviction behind her own nodding that evening. Then, in the second week of the following November, almost exactly 1 year after that first listing had landed in front of me at her kitchen table in Millville, Yvonne Marchetti called my cell phone directly for the first time since my contract had ended the previous March. Her voice sounded tight in a way that told me, before she had even said one single word to me, that something out along that stretch of highway had gone badly wrong once again. Somehow, already, less than 8 months after I had finally driven away from it for good that spring. She asked without much preamble whether I would consider returning to the Amber Light on an emergency basis, since the clerk who replaced me had stopped responding to the Trust's daily check-in calls 3 full days earlier that same week. The remote camera mounted near the office porch showed the amber sign dark for 2 consecutive nights running, and the ledger's last logged entry. According to a photograph Yvonne texted me directly while we were still on that same call, consisted of only 4 words written in a hand growing steadily less steady across the page. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for a long moment, looking out Danielle's kitchen window at a gray Millville evening that felt 1,000 miles removed from that quiet stretch of Pine Barren and everything sealed beneath the bog out there. I found myself doing the math on debts I no longer owed and a life I had only just begun, quietly rebuilding for myself and for Mateo both, and somewhere underneath all of that careful arithmetic, I felt the old cold certainty settle back into my chest exactly the way it had that first winter along that road. I understood that whatever still lingered beneath that sealed cellar now knew my particular rhythm better than anyone else alive, and that some part of me had known, from the moment I first drove away the previous March, that the property was never really finished with me at all, not truly. I told Yvonne I needed until morning to decide, and she agreed, though the strain in her voice made clear she did not really think morning would change much of anything about the situation waiting for me out there along that highway. I did not sleep that night either, sitting instead at Danielle's kitchen table with Spears' journal open in front of me to the passage about welcome. Reading it again by the light of the one lamp I now kept burning in every room without exception, the way I had so many nights that long winter at the motor court. I thought about Desmond Farrow, whose contract had ended clean, according to Iris Bellingham, and about the clerk after him, whose sign had gone dark, and whose ledger entry had trailed off mid-sentence while I sat safe in an apartment nearly 50 miles away from all of it that whole autumn. I thought about the sunken concrete marker beneath the bog near the tree line, and about the $1,200 in cash still folded inside an envelope in my dresser drawer. Money I had never quite been able to bring myself to spend on anything as ordinary as groceries or rent that whole year. By the time the sun finally came up over the parking lot outside Danielle's window, I had already packed a bag I told myself was only for driving out to briefly assess things. Though some part of me that had spent 4 months checking that sign every evening already understood there was very little left to actually assess out there. I called Yvonne back a little after 7 that morning and told her I would drive out, though I made her promise the trust would send someone to meet me there this time. A maintenance man named Pete Ostrowski, who had apparently worked for the trust on various properties for nearly a decade by then, in case whatever waited out there required more than a single woman with a borrowed handgun and a battery lantern to properly manage it again that season. She agreed almost too quickly. The relief plane even threw the phone line and told me Pete would meet me at the Chatsworth General Store by early that same afternoon with enough supplies for at least a full week, in case the situation out there proved as bad as the last 2 days of silence already suggested it might be. I spent the drive south out of Millville running through everything I still remembered from Spears' journal. The sign, the ledger, the phone, the welcome, turning each detail over in my mind the way I once turned barcodes under a warehouse scanner back before any of this began for me that first autumn. I checked every single piece of it against a memory I had learned the hard way not to trust to feeling alone anymore, not after everything that Stretch Up Highway had already taught me across one long, grinding winter of my own life out there. Somewhere past Hamilton, the radio lost its last clear station, and I drove the remaining miles in a silence broken only by tires humming against cold pavement and, once, the sound of my own voice saying Pete's name aloud just to hear something other than my own thoughts filling that car. Pete turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had worked maintenance crews across 3 different counties before finally landing with the trust some years earlier that same decade. And he talked easily the whole drive out from Chatsworth about nothing in particular, weather and gas prices and a daughter starting college that fall, apparently unaware of anything unusual about the property waiting for us that afternoon. We reached the motor court a little before 4 o'clock that same cold day. The light already slanting low and gray across the gravel lot the way it always seemed to that time of year along that particular stretch of highway above the bog. I felt something tight and hard in my chest at the very first sight of that office building. The amber sign still standing exactly where I had left it the previous March. Dark now and rimed thick with frost against the failing afternoon light around it. The replacement clerk's car sat parked at an angle near the last cabin on the row, driver's door still hanging wide open, and there were no footprints at all leading away from it anywhere in the thin layer of frost that covered that whole section of gravel surrounding the office and the cabins behind it. There was only a single set of tracks circling the vehicle twice before ending abruptly near the office steps, as though whoever made them had simply stopped partway through their own third slow loop around that car, without ever finishing it out there that same evening. I called out his name, a name Yvonne had given me over the phone that morning, Grady, twice into that silent lot, and I got nothing back at all beyond the sound of wind moving steady and low through the pines surrounding the whole property that afternoon. I checked the office first, moving quickly without needing to talk myself through it, and found the ledger sitting open on the desk to a final entry written in a hand far less steady than my own had ever been even during that nor'easter the previous December out there along that road. It read only 4 words. It wants to stay, followed by nothing else at all, no signature and no closing note, the pen itself still lying where it had apparently rolled off the desk sometime after whoever wrote that final line had stopped writing anything more that same day. I found no sign of Grady anywhere in the office, the archive closet, or any of the 11 cabins standing along that row, and I did not go looking beyond the marked boundary of the tree line that same evening. Some old and hard-learned instinct telling me plainly that whatever had happened to him had already happened well before Pete and I had ever arrived there that particular afternoon in the fading light. I checked my watch and saw I had perhaps 18 minutes of true daylight left before the whole property went fully dark around that silent lot. And I understood, standing there in the cold with an empty car and an open door and no man anywhere to be found, exactly what needed doing next, regardless of anything else, still unresolved that evening. I walked to the breaker panel with hands that remembered the motion far better than my own conscious mind did, resetting the sign of the second attempt the way it always had for me across that whole long winter the year before. And I watched the amber glow finally catch and steady against the coming dark while Pete stood a careful distance back near the shed door, watching me with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and the beginning of real understanding. I checked the office ledger one final time before the light fully failed, writing the date and Pete's name and my own into the entry the house rules had always required of every guest, every visitor, every single person who ever stood on that property after dark, regardless of the circumstances that brought them there. When the amber light finally settled into its steady, familiar glow above the office roof, the whole property went quiet in that same unbearable way I remembered from the nor'easter the year before. No wind, no murmuring, nothing at all, before the ordinary sounds of evening slowly returned around us both in that gravel lot. I did not call Yvonne that night the way I had promised her I would, choosing instead to sit through the full dark hours in that office with the sign burning steadily above me and the borrowed handgun within easy reach, listening to a silence I understood now better than I understood almost anything else left in my own life. I never found Grady Sims, not that night and not in the days that followed once a proper search crew finally made it out that highway behind us, and the trust closed the file on him quietly the same practiced way I imagine it had closed every file like it going back over 80 years on that same property. I stayed on through that whole second winter without ever fully deciding to, some part of me understanding that a debt does not simply end because the woman who first agreed to pay it wants very badly for it to be finished with her once and for all. I still keep a lamp burning in every room of wherever I happen to be living now, and some evenings, right around the hour the light finally starts to fail outside my window, I find myself standing very still and listening for a sound I both hope and dread. I will never hear again in this life. I think sometimes about Spear's line, that it is not memory in the way we mean the word among the living, but that it keeps a guest list all the same, and I have come to understand, more than I ever wanted to, exactly what it means to be a name someone else is still waiting to welcome home.